Hello and welcome to the lesson. Today we're going to learn how CSS cascading works. Let's take a look at our first simple example. In the document you can see a first level heading. Here in the Style Definition section I'll change the color of all H1 elements. After refreshing the page we can see that the heading has turned red. It has, however, retained other characteristics, such as its size. Let's keep in mind that the characteristics we don't change with CSS will still be defined by HTML specifications. I'll now enclose the H1 element inside the div block element. Inside the Style Definition section, I'll specify the div selector and add the font size property. I'll set the value to 13 pixels. We can review the changes after refreshing the browser. Notice the heading is now printed in a smaller font. How is this possible when I didn't add any new properties under the heading selector? As you can see, the H1 element is located inside the div element. That is why it inherited its formatting, specifically the font size property. This principle is known in CSS as inheritance. Finally, I'll add a new selector to the Style Definition section, again for the H1 headings. Again, I'll add the color property, but this time I'll set the value to blue. We have now set up two identical selectors with the same properties, only the values differ. After refreshing the page, we see that the heading has become blue. Why didn't the browser prioritize the first selector? It's because priorities in CSS work in exactly the opposite way. The later you specify a CSS rule within your document, the higher its priority will be. I'll now open up another document in my editor and load it into the browser as well. Notice the first level heading and two paragraphs, all enclosed within a div element. I'll add an H1 selector under the Style Definition section and set the value of the color property to green. Now I'll add another selector inside the Style Definition section. This time the selector targets all first level headings inside div elements. Once again, I'll specify the color property, but this time I'll set the value to red and refresh the page. As we can see, the heading is now formatted according to the selector listed earlier in the Style Definition section. Why? You see, the so-called specificity of a selector carries more weight than its position within the document. Specificity means how specific the selector is. The first selector only chooses those H1 elements that are inside div elements. The second selector targets all H1 elements in the document. As we can see, our heading is more accurately described by the first selector, and that's why its formatting is used. Now I'll assign a class to the heading. I'll add the class attribute inside the H1 opening tag and set the value to heading. Inside the Style Definition section, I'll add a heading class selector and set the color property to blue. After refreshing the page, we can see that the heading has changed color, this time to blue. Class selectors have a higher specificity than simple element selectors. Next, I'll add an ID and set its value to main heading. Inside the Style section, I'll add an ID selector and set the color property. I'll set the value to green, for example, and refresh the page. As you might have expected, formatting specified by the ID selector has been used for the heading. Remember that an identifier selector is more specific than a simple element selector or a class selector. Even greater specificity is applied to inline style specifications. Let's give it a try. First, I'll add the style attribute inside the H1 opening tag. Next, I'll specify the color property and set its value to black. After refreshing the page, we can see that the browser has used the formatting defined in the inline style specification. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll look forward to seeing you at the next lesson.